So the tax office impounded my bank account, and Audible yanked some of my new orders because they actually weren't paid for. So I had to do the thing that I always do in that situation, which happens more often than you might think. I had to go back and listen to stuff that has been there for a long time. And now I'm here to talk about it. Welcome back, everybody. This is me talking about 3 books that I've read before, and they're fantastic. The Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. Let's do this. Cheers. Alright, so this is going to be a discussion full of spoilers and stuff about the Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. I'll give a quick why you definitely should read this spoiler-free section as always, and then we'll talk about what makes these books so important even now and still very much relevant, and that's what I'll spend most of the time doing today. So let's get this started and talk about why you should read it if you haven't yet, or maybe go and reread it. The Broken Earth is a trilogy, 3 novels, the 5th season, The Obelisk Gate, and The Stone Sky, and they were published from 2015 to 17 or 16 to 18. I always confuse those dates. Point is, they've been around for a couple of years now. They won 3 consecutive Hugos, which is something no one has done before, and they're really worth it. They are what you might call fantasy or science fiction. Science fantasy, I guess, is the term here. It's what you've heard before for stuff like Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun and other things like that. And they broadly could fall into the what you might call Dying Earth subgenre if you really want to, but I don't want to. They're a very unique thing. You follow several characters as they navigate a very unique setting, a very unique world that is at the brink of catastrophe. And you have to ask yourself, maybe the end of the world is actually a good thing. Which, yeah, it is sometimes. And they're dark, they're extremely moving, and they're extremely well written in a lot of ways, fascinatingly constructed and executed in, loving levels. They have incredible world building and a fantastic magic system. Here, I almost sound like one of those booktubers. Now let's actually fill those 2 sentences with some meaning, because incredible world building, nothing really. So, they are in a unique world in that it does differ completely from what we're used to when we talk about fantasy, which is, pseudo-medieval places with wizards, or pseudo-oriental places with turbaned wizards, or, things have gotten a lot better in that regard, so don't worry, I'm aware of that. But it is a place that is, interestingly enough, very loosely described, so we can all fill in our own ideas of how things look in a way. The world has a few, key ideas, which are, there's old technology lying around, something that we know from stuff like The Dying Earth or Book of the New Sun and other stuff like that. There is some form of magic in there, we'll get into that as well, and the world is defined by those 5th seasons. That means it's a seismically very active world where things can go, bump at any point, and then they go bump very spectacularly, and the, resulting ash falls and whatnot lead to what is called a 5th season, which is what you get when you, nuke the dinosaurs out of the place, or something like that. A global catastrophe that does impact all human and animal life on the planet. And that's one of those, key, unique world-building things that we find here, but you can also find in something like, A Song of Ice and Fire, where the key idea is that seasons last longer than 1 year, which is one of those things that stick out and make a world building, make a world feel unique in a way. As I said, having old technology is not necessarily a new thing. I'm not going to go too deeply into that stuff because it kind of becomes spoilery, and I don't want to spoil this stuff because I'm nice today. But we have these ideas and have a world that is completely built on that one principle, which is the way society is organized is to be able to survive said fifth seasons, for example. And it is executed, and this is what I meant, extremely well, because you can feel these elements in whenever something about the world comes out. You can always relate it to the fact that this is a society that is constantly threatened by, extinction because of a massive earthquake or a volcano erupting or other seismic activity. And the way it is consistently implemented, I guess, is the word here, is what I would say is unique and very good world building, because a lot of places don't mention, a lot of settings don't manage to actually do that. They have like, here's a cool thing, and then it never really matters again. This is not this kind of book. So here we go. Fantastic world building. What about the magic system, do you say? Well, let me talk about the magic system. It's earth power. It's like we have people that can use magic, orogeny, and they can manipulate the earth. Lava flows, they can quell earthquakes, they can presumably also create earthquakes, stuff like that. And it's an innate ability. They can be trained, but they either have or have not that capability. So that's what I would call a very good magic system, because it's a very specific way of how magic works in this world. It's manipulating the flows of, and tectonics and stuff like that in the earth, which is really cool. It has a sort of pseudo-scientific idea. It's like, there's like specific sense organs that can give you that kind of power. And then it plays around with that. It's like, you train, you get better, and when you do it, you get exhausted, which is the, I don't want to call it a soft magic system, because there is a basic rule. And that basic rule is you train, you get better, but it's exhausting. So there's a basic cost energy kind of thing that makes magic work, which makes magic work in, say, Tolkien. Like when Gandalf tries to lock a door, he's pretty exhausted when the guy on the other side is a Balrog. That kind of thing. So perfect magic system, very unique. No one has to ingest metals and jump around like in a video game. You can just actually have a cool magic system just like that. So there you go. This is how you talk about magic systems and world buildings without just saying incredible and fascinating. And with that said, yes, you should go and definitely read these books. They have a lot to say about our society. They are a masterclass in how to construct a contemporary or modern science fiction or fantasy, a speculative fiction book that can compel through its story, through its characters, and still drive home some pretty important points about the world, which is what we're going to talk about in the spoiler talk, which starts now. Oh, hi. Trigger warnings. Yeah, there's dark stuff in there. Be aware of that. There is, especially when it comes to harm to children, that stuff's in there, and it can be triggering, so be aware of that. Beyond that, let's talk about spoilers. All right, you're still here? That's perfect. I hope you enjoyed the books. Let's talk about why The Broken Earth works so wonderfully. And now there is that idea that the fifth season is the best one, and the second one and the third one don't really match up. I disagree, and I'll try to explain why later. But let's start and look at why the fifth season did, land as well as it did with so many people. And I did look back and looked at some older videos by some famous booktubers, and they loved these books, this book too, the fifth season that is. And everyone talks about something here, and that is the structure. Now, don't get me wrong. I like the structure of this novel. Full spoilers, the whole idea that the first novel is all about the same character, just told in three parallel narratives from three formative parts of her life. But the fact that everyone was like, wow, I didn't see this coming, or wow, I've never seen anything done like that, is kind of baffling. It's like, if you haven't read a lot of fiction in general, yeah, I can see how that may be something that comes as a shock, but it's just executed extremely well, and something that kind of diverges from the standard, fantasy narrative that we have these days. But if you, for example, go and read Chasm City by Alistair Reynolds, you find a similar idea. Like the idea that you have like something told as 2 or 3 or whatever narratives, and then you find out that those are actually the same story, just from different perspectives or whatever. It's not exactly new. It's just new to, the fantasy genre, not even new to the fantasy genre, but very rare in contemporary fantasy or science fiction. Anyway, let's put that out of the way. I mean, look, there's stuff like is it use of weapons by Ian Banks that does some really interesting stuff when it comes to playing around with time and perspective in narratives and shift those to create stuff. So anyway, it's not brand new, but, and this I think is important, it is executed extremely well in a lot of ways. And there we need to talk about, well, the structure, obviously, the perspectives. We have, Damaya, I think that's her name, in the child version. We have Cyanide, the core raga, the fulcrum raga story, origin story. And we have, obviously, the you perspective, Esun. And something that is really interesting, because everyone's like, oh, this is second person, it's so hard to read. Yeah, it's kind of a bit of a shift, but, second person singular, it does work wonderfully if you're into that. But what it really does, and where it plays a lot in a very fascinating way, is, and we tend to overlook that because we're not used to that kind of second perspective, right? Second person writing is, second person has a very specific narrator. And the question who that narrator might be is one that I guess we tend to not ask unless, we're like used to it, because it's like, yeah, whatever. We focus too much on the person and not too much, not enough on the narrator in that regard. And if you will, this at the end of the day is a first person narrative. It's a first person, probably unreliable narrator, but yeah, you just hear that person tell the story to different, in different modes over time. And I found that is the real kicker about this book. I mean, no, everyone knows that, who's finished at least book 1, but it is still interesting to see how that works. And yeah, it's well done. I just feel that we should be aware of the fact that it's nothing groundbreaking. It's just, and that's where we'll end up with this whole discussion, it's just incredibly well done by someone who knows what they're about. And now let's look at some of the other important aspects here, and that is definitely character work. And then we need to talk about the themes, of course. Character work in book 1, I feel, is important because it does something that we rarely see done in genre fiction. Obviously, some characters, some authors do it and do it well, but the idea that a person is the sum of all the things that happen over a lifetime is one that we tend to forget, because a lot of epic fantasy, a lot of fantasy focuses on one specific relatively short adventure of something happening. And we're like, yeah, what happens to those heroes afterwards? And yes, there's a bunch of books that have like the old hero coming back or suffering from PTSD or whatever. We go and look at Trust the Legend in Legend. He's an old guy at that point. It's like so the idea of the grizzled veteran is something that we know, but to see all like 3 formative periods in parallel, see how they interplay, how stuff that happened to a person, in this case our main character here, Esun, as a child, how that impacts how she behaves in her 20s, and how those two then interplay and create the person in her 40s that we have in the third narrative in book 1. That's something that I feel isn't done too often, and this book in particular does do it very well, where you can see how those different experiences have formed a very complex character. And obviously the message here is we should probably go and interrogate our own past, see how our own childhood experiences or stuff as adolescents, while we were at, I don't know, college, whatever, how those made us the people that we are now. Because we tend to edit in a way. We tend to edit our own narrative of how our own life works, which is something that we wonderfully see contrasted here between book 1 and book 3, because obviously in book 1 here we have our narrator tell Esun basically her full story, what happens, all the stuff she did, all the stuff that is not really very nice, forcing her to remember all of these things. But in book 3, The Stone Sky, our narrator steps into the front and talks about his own life in the very far distant past. And yeah, should we trust him? How much does he actually leave out? How much does he edit out of that story? That, I feel, is an interesting aspect that we kinda sometimes overlook, because we have the contrast of the edited narrative that builds our image of ourselves and the unedited one, which is the reality of ourselves. And I found that, as I said, it was just like executed extremely well in these books over the overarching thing. And I do feel that without that third book, the first book would lose some impact, because, we see someone with an edited narrative of their past, which was Hoa in that case, but we also see, especially in book 2 and 3, how the experiences of Esun, the Maya, and Cyanide in book 1, how they basically perpetuate themselves in her daughter Nasun, right? We see how many traits her daughter has inherited, and how many of those are just perpetuating, specific aspects of a society that is far from ideal. And that is obviously something that I have spoken about before. Something is one of those themes that resonated so well with me, because it's something that we've seen, at least those of us who have gone and read the Malazan Book of the Fallen. That's one of the big themes that we see in the works of Stephen Erickson as well. It's like how these cycles of abuse and violence and marginalization, how those cycles of violence perpetuate themselves from generation to generation, and how it's exactly that bit that needs to be broken. That perpetuation needs to be broken if we want to have any form of a chance at a future, or want our children to have better lives. That's interesting to see how that actually is played out in this book, because it does have something of a happy end, where it's a tragic happy end, but it's still when Esun does actually just leave off and gives Nasun the chance to be whoever Nasun wants to be, by sacrificing herself at the end, of course. But that's I think an interesting ending in that regard. And as I said, book 1 would lose some impact if book 2 and book 3 would not work the way they work. All right, let's tackle the bigger ones. Now, obviously, there is a lot of context here, a lot of subtext that is very much not sub, but very text, about the very specific ideas of slavery, of racism, and marginalization because of racism. And I'll make this very clear, I am not someone who has any personal experience in that area. I'm still pretty much top of the food chain in that regard, as a white dude in a predominantly white country. My point is, it is still extremely impactful for someone like me to read that. While I can't connect on like a personal level to that, I do think it's extremely valuable for me to read something like this and with these elements in it and learn from them. Because, they're systemic, and systems need to be understood before we can actually break them in a meaningful way. And I'll try to connect this once again to stuff that I've read recently, which is Thomas Covenant, because there's a different aspect here. It's like societies that very distinctly decide if you're in the in-group or the out-group, whether you accept it or not, do put a lot of pressure on those that are put on the outside, on the marginalized. And being marginalized can and does lead to that very specific situation where you lose the understanding, because you've never actually had it or felt it, of how society works. And we see that very clearly with Essin, who has been, through a lot, how difficult it is for her to actually trust, to accept that she's part of a community, that there is such a thing as community, that she can trust others, because that hasn't, been taken away from her so long. So when she actually arrives in that commune, whose name I keep forgetting, with Ika and the others, Kostrima, that's the place, in Kostrima, you can see her not being able to actually settle into that kind of society because she has been disenfranchised, cut off so hard. It's exactly the situation that I would say, Thomas Covenant struggles with in, Stephen R. Donaldson tries to express in a very specific other way, but those elements are the same, and to understand that they are systemic. The marginalization of people with a disability, while being different from the marginalization through racism and the heritage of slavery, they can be compared in certain regards, because once again, disenfranchisement and persecution are systemic. Which, once again, going back to R.I. Moore's Convention of a Persecuting Society, we started, disenfranchising and marginalizing people, at least in the West, around the same time for different groups of people. And to see that, once again, I felt, there's a deeper point here. It's like, don't marginalize people, because it will leave lasting scars. And they, once again, I think this is important, they will stay over generations, over a lot of generations. And I think that's another aspect that I personally appreciate these books showing so clearly. Now, obviously, as I said, there's much more there. The idea that one group is constantly dehumanized, exploited as a tool, as a weapon, as all kinds of things to make society work and make society stable through their, exploitation in the most brutal way. That is obviously a very powerful image, a very powerful metaphor. Dare I say, I will not say allegory here. But, so yeah, the idea that you can look for experiences and the lasting damage, and I think this is the important bit, the lasting damage that that's such a thing as chattel slavery does leave on a group. I think that part is really important, and I think these books handle it well, because there is that discussion like slavery is over, so get over it. That doesn't work, because we have that generational trauma. We have these things perpetuating, which we see in Nasun, who is not a slave, because she's not a fulcrum. She doesn't end up at the fulcrum in that sort of situation, but she still carries all those scars through her experience, through her mother, who came out of that system. So yeah, even if you abandon a system or leave a system, it will still leave its mark and its damage on people for generations, several of them. And I think the fact that these books tackle that aspect fairly well, I might just add, is incredibly powerful, incredibly important and meaningful. And now let's look at some more of these aspects. The ending. And the idea that some things are just so broken that you can't fix them. I really love that. I really appreciate that. There's one moment in book 3 when Nasun just tells Shafa that she just wants to see the whole world burn and just burn it all down, to end all the suffering, to end all those repeating cycles of abuse, violence, destruction. And I get it. I so get it. It's one of the most powerful moments in the entire trilogy for me. Was that situation where it's like a society, a world that has come to the place where children feel that the only way to actually get some meaning, some dignity back is by actually destroying the entire world. Well, that world deserves to actually end. Sometimes some things, some systems are so broken that they need to be completely broken and end before you can actually start anew. And that, unfortunately, does also translate back to characters, some of us, our personalities are just so broken that there is no real mending, no real healing. There's always, we can continue, we can muddle on, we can fight on, but we are so locked in our very specific personalities, our very specific experiences, that becoming a new human is no longer possible. And the fact that Esun, Cyanide, Damaya is one such person who has just suffered so much that at the end of the day there is no fixing. The only option there is a rebirth in a different form. Yeah, it's a very powerful message, and it's one that we tend to overlook with a lot of fantasy that we read or that is published these days. Usually, heroes either die gloriously or they win gloriously. The idea of, having all these damages that we just keep dragging, that we're not able to fully get out of a specific pattern, that's something that we see rarely and acknowledge rarely, because these events in fantasy and science fiction, they damage people, and we should acknowledge that. Yeah, same for, say, Frodo Baggins at the end of Lord of the Rings. There's no returning for him. He has to leave and go into the West to get some form of healing there, which I guess you can interpret as some form of rebirth or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, so that element I found extremely powerful and meaningful, the way it is portrayed. Environmental damage. Let's talk about that for a moment. So obviously the big thing is that there is an actual war between the Earth and humanity, because humanity fucked up the planet so bad that the planet started fighting back. And, something we've seen before in different ways. It ties back to the whole Gaia hypothesis, just goes one step further, which is, you know what? If you assume that the planet, our biosphere, whatever you want to call it, and obviously it goes deeper and goes actually into, the actual planet here, which, why not? Yeah, maybe at some point the world has enough and just fights back. I think that's a very valid thing that we need to understand. Or it speaks at least to something that I guess a lot of us do already know, which is where a lot of environmentalist fervor comes from. Is that we feel like we fucked it real up. There's an idea of guilt in there that is obviously expressed here through having the Earth actually fighting back. And I found that very interesting, because it manages to speak to that very specific element. It kind of reminds me, once again, if you go to Malaz, and especially certain characters in Dust of Dreams and The Crippled God, which express that same fear or same possibility of nature, the Earth, actually paying back or fighting back to end it all. Because once again, sometimes destruction is the only way to actually be free here. And that's, once again, a very powerful message that I appreciate a lot in these books. All right, normalization. There's something here. There's one scene near the end of book one, middle of book one, where Esun realized that Tonki is actually Bina from the Damaya plot line and so forth. And you're like, all right, so we figured out who that girl is, who that woman is. And then there's one in maybe two scenes where it is clear that Tonki is in fact trans. And then it just doesn't matter anymore. And that's what I mean by normalization. That is really important. It's yeah, look, there's enough things to be interested about this character. That part does rarely play a role. It does inform how she acts, and that's great. But it's not further. It just happens on the side. You're so caught up with so many other elements that are way more important than gender that you're yeah, you know what? There we go. We have shown trans people being people, and that's it. And now we're actually focusing on them being people and having people problems than anything else. Similar aspects happen, obviously, in general when it comes to gender and sexuality in these books. The very interesting relationship that Cyanide, Alabaster, and Inon, is that his name, have during that plot line in book one. Yeah, It just happened. It's natural, and we have dealt with sexuality in a sexual identity in a very tender human way, where it's just just one other way of living. And I think there's more instances in these books about that, where Ika being bi and having varying sexual partners, and yeah, that's just like how these things work. And to just have a world where this is not a book series, where this is not the main focus of the narrative, it just happens in the margins, and you just like you just keep going on. It's like there's more interesting things going on, which at the end of the day is how things should actually be. Last bit. Once again, the racism. So I said before, I'm obviously white. I'm living in a fairly, still fairly white country out here. I have no idea what, like, Afro-American existence is like. But this book gave me ideas by not being, by being fantasy, but still having all these small elements. The focus on how people wear their hair, on skin color, how people are dehumanized, how that stuff still happens on the sidelines from time to time. That constant, being othered and having that constant feeling still is something that I have not in my life, but seeing it in these books makes it slightly less difficult for me to get in that brain space, I guess, or at least be more empathetic to it and respect it more in a way that, I mean, on an emotional level that goes beyond like rationally, I know this happens. And this is the strength of literature to allow us that very brief glimpse into a different way of looking at the world. And this is the big advantage of the fantasy and science fiction community becoming more inclusive. Because a white dude could never write a book like this. And we'd be deprived of that very specific perspective on life, on that very specific way of looking at the world. And that would be terrible. It would impoverish us in a lot of ways. So having all these additional perspectives, having all this slowly beginning inclusivity in fantasy is a fantastic thing. So yeah, I feel The Broken Earth is an absolute masterpiece. Still, it holds up after 5 years and a bit being out, and I assume it will be in that long history of powerful, moving and important pieces of speculative fiction, like the works of, say, Ursula Le Guin and others that have made fantasy and science fiction such a powerful genre. Anyway, let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, do the good things, join the Patreon if you feel like it, and yeah, have a great day. Cheers.